So Scott Lucas, thank you for remixing the entire idea of cultural heritage here, grounding the middle voice in a broad spectrum of academic ideas. I'm delighted that I'm going to be able to go back and look again at your ideas in depth. Is the paper itself online as well as the images? Okay, or maybe attach it to that piece so it can analyze it. As I was listening to this talk, I was already feeling about the fact that I wanted to think about it 3 or 4 times through in all of its depth and I mean, you were remixing my mind even more than your book has done. In continuing the theme of using books and presenting the authors as our speakers, Ken Feinstein and James Morris are the next speakers. I've known of Ken's on the faculty with me here at the School of Art, Design, and Media, and I've seen his work in presentations, and he's talked of a colleague, but I was delighted to be able to meet his colleague in person along the way. They both have published books. They're both in the libraries here at ADM, and they're both checked out. And it was like, the good news and the bad news is, how am I going to hold up a book along the way? So I went to Amazon.com this morning, and here I am holding up the covers of the books as I pulled them off Amazon.com because I couldn't pick them up in our libraries as part of this. Ken's book is called The Image That Doesn't Want to Be Seen, and let me read just a little bit of what Amazon is written about Amazon. I hope you wrote this, Ken. When we talk about photography, we talk about the image. When we ask someone to take a picture of me, we are putting ourselves in the hands of others. We are making them responsible for us and to us. At the heart, it is about the performance of the pose. The act of creating the image takes priority over the image produced. The responsibility of the self to others and otherness is enacted in the creation of the amateur photograph. I flipped my mind upside down when I was thinking about that. And James's book is called Computers Create Art, and the introduction on the website says, digital technology dominates our hyper-mediated culture, and some evangelists are arguing that in only a few decades it will completely surpass human abilities and power. But will computers be able to replicate and transcend every aspect of human intelligence? And with that, I invite the two of you to please come on up, set your computer to run, and show us your show. Thanks very much. Welcome to our stage. James was here yesterday. Ken was here as a visitor. Now you're on stage. So you need to swap up. It could take just a second to swap up and get our PowerPoint up.
Is this right? Yeah. We don't need. All right. Yeah. You need it?
Well, I'm going to use this microphone and Ken's going to use the wireless
So
one.
which is?
So Ken's going to control the laptop.
All right. Where is the slideshow?
Okay, Ken, where's your show?
That's open.
Where, it's not on the screen.
It's not open. No, we are not showing it yet. Okay.
That's why it's not showing.
Oh wait, it's not plugged in.
I think it's not plugged in. No, it's not plugged in yet. Oh, it's okay, I'll do it. Yeah, don't do that.
No, it's on the other side.
Let me plug it in so that because we need to get the screen up there so that it doesn't go. If it wasn't plugged in.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine.
So, okay.
Do you start?
Thank you for a great introduction. It kind of our work fits in very well with what we're talking about. The name of a project that we're working on. Can you guys hear me? Oh my God. Oh, hell. I don't want that. Bloody hell. Now back way down to here.
turn me up so I'm louder than him, so I can speak more clear now.
Yeah, he has more important. He's more interesting. I'm just.
We're going to be doing like a double act, like Abbott and Costello, maybe.
I'm kind of figuring Penn and Teller, and I'm Teller, and he's Penn.
Is that a compliment? I'm not sure.
We'll have a conversation about that later.
Okay. We'll do it like the Pope.
Like the Pope, and what?
Which
I'm
will
Jesus,
involve,
and I'm Jesus
which
as the
involve-
little
Which
as
will
the
involve
as the
violence,
puppet.
apparently, according to
Okay.
the Pope earlier.
So,
yesterday.
so our project is called Temporal
This is
Chaos.
presentational chaos. Coming
Yes.
Right here.
And Temporal Chaos. And Temporal Chaos, the important word, obviously from you can tell right now, is the word chaos. And what we're interested in doing is bringing the concepts of time space, and of history together, conceptually, and in a physical environment. And this works. So the conceptual framework for this, we built a conceptual framework. We came up with an idea that we wanted to do, and we had certain issues that we wanted to talk about. And so I just want to go over what sort of the basic, the issues that we're discussing in relation to this work. If this works. So we kind of have said, what are the contemporary concerns and how are they going to parallel historically with earlier concerns? And then I'll explain how this is physically manifested within the installation that we're making. Should I go back and explain that I guess I should go back a little bit and explain the installation will be 2 pieces in 2 cities simultaneously. So there'll be one version of the installation in London, which will be communicating with the installation in Singapore. So the 2 will be in dialogue with each other. So that's important because one of the issues that we're concerned about is the dialogue on globalization that's happening, and the concept.
But that's not the only dialogue that's happening. It's also a dialogue with history at each of the locations as well.
Well, yeah.
And heritage.
I was going to say, these are in relation to the contemporary concerns. We're interested in the contemporary concept of globalization, because when we talk about the historical, we'll be going on what the historical concepts of globalization are. We're also interested in the idea of telepresence, how we communicate with each other from distances, and the history of telepresence, and how this has worked historically. Now we think of telepresence, and I wanted to bring in telephones, because I think it's really, once we started to have intercontinental telephones, we laid the first cable lines at the end of the end of the 19th century, we started to get to this place where what I find fascinating is if I use Skype, if I use a telephone, whatever, I talk to my brother back who is in Canada, it's 12 hours behind, 13 hours now with daylight savings. And I'm talking to someone yesterday. And we've actually sort of, there's a concept of it feels present, but it's also time travel. And there's that concept of time travel, of where we are in time. That telepresence, that we're unloosened from time, I think is a very important thing that we need to be more conscious of in relation to modern technology. And there's also now, and a lot of us here are within this situation, of what is the contemporary form of migration. And that we're now in a time. There are a lot of political situations, if you talk about Syria and places like that, where we're dealing with forced immigration to other countries. But for the most part, we look at most of what we have as migration, the idea that people are moving from place to place for businesses. We're a little bit more, and that if we leave, we can come back, which has not always been true in the histories of migration across history.
And there's also the sense that the linking between digital telepresence and migration as well, how they work together to enable each other.
Yeah, that they allow us, this idea of being able to go back and forth is very much tied to the idea that we can always be still tied to things. That I can be online and I can still read, I can read my hometown newspaper every day online, where in the past, you would have something like the Jewish Daily Forward in New York, which would be in Yiddish, and everyone who read it were Yiddish speaking, and they were back from the old country, as you would say. But it's the American view of what was happening back there. I can't have that direct access that we now have. We're also interested very much in the idea of, I accidentally jumped ahead a couple, of multinational corporations and their sort of place with things like the TPP, if you're all familiar with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a trade treaty that's happening right now, that they're negotiating right now, where corporations, and this does have a historical precedence, definitely in was it East India
East
Trade
India
Company,
Trading Company, yeah.
East India Trading Company, that the corporations become sort of more powerful as beyond national entities, and how that also reflects back into things like migration. That, you know, I remember recently meeting someone who works for Qatar Airlines, and so he works for an airline who one of their policies is they move him around every 2 years. And that migration can be determined more through the relationship to multinational corporations than it is to nationalism. And also the idea that nationalism in and of itself, which is sort of more of an 18th and 19th century concept, is kind of, with things like multinational corporations and things like the TPP and free trade zones agreements, and just sort of regional identities, things like the ASEAN here and so on, that nationalism is starting to transform itself also into a kind of multinationalism, which can be a regionalism or it can be a nationalism almost more built like we are in a we belong to a nation, and that is the academic nation. And it's another form of multinationalism. It doesn't matter that that we live in Singapore, Italy, wherever. We belong to the nation of academia. And these are all issues that we're interested in looking at. And the thing is that as we take these issues and we take these thoughts and we think about how that puts us in a sense of what we can call the present, is it sort of helps build our contemporary understanding of what is time-space, of where we are in time and space and the relationship between the two, that we think of ourselves in a four-dimensional world, which is a time-space world, as opposed to just saying, well, I am here in a physical sense, in just a three-dimensional space. Now, yeah.
I think this links very nicely to what Scott was talking about with the notion that heritage is just always going to be a temporal thing. It's always going to be a hybrid. You know, the Las Vegas interpretation of Paris, of Italy, which I personally love and find absolutely hilarious as a European, is the natural state. Maybe there is no such thing as the original heritage to which it's reflecting, which I guess is your comment about your point about the postmodern condition. Is that's what postmodernists are saying, is that that there is nothing but the hybrid.
I would say that for us, we're pretty much approaching the idea of heritage as not being about a preservation of a past or anything like this, but that heritage is about existing within a continuum, which addresses both the past and a future, and the use of things and the use of both concepts of past, present, and future sort of simultaneously and continuously, that it's always moving, it's always evolving, and that's its point. It's not slicing things and looking at one moment at a time. It's about duration and not about a difference in degree, and slicing a moment of degree and saying that's where it is and it stops there and it only exists there because that isn't what it is. Life is, it's about lived experience, and lived experience is in duration.
I mean, Heidegger has this concept of the art preserver, which I'm sure some of you have come across, which is, that art only exists in the eye of the beholder, and it ceases to have relevance once the beholder no longer sees it as relevant. So it needs the eyes of the contemporary person to be preserved and to continue to be relevant.
Or as Duchamp said, no work is finished until it's exhibited, until there's an audience, until it is in dialogue, exists within duration, then it doesn't exist. So within the historical, we're contrasting the idea, and you'll see within the images of the installation, we're trying to contrast it with 18th and 19th century globalization, and emphasizing the fact that one of the things that we're trying to emphasize is that we talk about globalization as if it's a new phenomenon, as if it's something that's a condition of today and never existed before. And again, I would like to refer back to the Hudson Bay Company and the East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Let's not forget our Dutch friends.
I'm happy to forget them.
Well, that's a whole other thing. But that it is a continuum, and that there are some things, the conditions that are different, and there are some things that are the same, and that we should never lose sight of that. And we should never lose sight of the great migrations, the great movements of people across in the 18th and 19th, and even before, of course. And that we can still talk about the idea of telepresence back then, but telepresence then would be not immediate and live, but it would be more through maybe newspapers moving back and forth, letters back home, people sending back memoirs. I mean, one of the most important ones that's really interesting is, is the invention of the cookbook. Right? The cookbook, someone was living in India, they go back to the UK, they want to remember, they have their servant write down the recipe so they can have that food back there. It's a form of telepresence. It's a form of bringing things from one place to another, let alone the idea of telepresence as opposed to physical movement of people, which is also one of the issues will be mentioned here too. If this, that's right, we jumped because of that. So now this is, we're trying to make a contrast. There's a difference between immigration and migration. And one of the differences is when I think of my grandparents, they were all born in Eastern Europe. They all grew up in the United States. They all left because they were forced to leave. And the one thing that was missing for them is the concept of ever being able to come back. You left, it was, returning was a closed door. And yes, there are still situations where this is true today, but the experience of, and it's true that there were some people in some places who could, like they say a third of the Italians who came to the United States went back to Italy. But if you look at the Irish, you look at the Jews, you look at a lot of people left and they never felt they could come back. And they never did come back. Today, migration is much more about the idea of the expatriate, the person who can go back and forth. And before, that wasn't really an option for most people. Even the distance of traveling, of being able to take a jet, and it's easy, it's 12 hours as opposed to months. And amount of income, movement is very different today.
And this is a tremendously important debate that's risen up in Europe at the moment with the re-rise of the right. What's going on, Charlie Hebdo, and the alleged Islamification of European society. Where you immigrate and you're not part of the original society, you're not part of the heritage of a country, we're trying to question that concept as well.
And this could have so easily been all settled by Genghis Khan if he'd actually taken Vienna.
Yeah.
It would have just settled all this, and we wouldn't have these problems today.
Or Napoleon.
What?
Or Napoleon.
Yeah,
Charlemagne.
yeah. Napoleon is always a good one. And so again, we're putting these things in parallel to say that these are things that we're thinking about in the differences in and what's contrasted and what's the same. So colonialization, again, is very much sort of, the act of colonialization has now sort of been taken over by the act of corporate colonialization and not being so much the nation states, although we never know how this can change, because the East India Company is an example of the failure of the company meant that the takeover of their nation, the British, became the British Empire because the company went under and the British had to take over their colonies. So you never know. But colonization now, what we'd call neo-colonization now, is less about physical ownership of things and more financial ownership of things. Things are changing, they're less in physical presence, but there's a definite relationship between the two that we should never forget. And then, of course, from the 18th and 19th century is the idea of the nation state and what that meant, and how, again, of course, how that relates back to things like colonialization and immigration and so on, as opposed to the multinational world that we seem to be living in today. And this all builds up to what was then a sense of space, of being somewhere, and the concept of time-space didn't exist yet. And today we have a concept of time-space. And that's what we wanted to sort of, this is kind of the kind of issues that we're trying to look at and trying to somehow put together into a physical installation. And kind of briefly, it's called Temporal Chaos. This is a visualization. We'll go into some more detail of what the idea of the space is. Obviously, it's a very dark space. This slide is much darker than it should be. We have to, we'll figure out that. So, should we go into the elements, or should I describe what it is more in general?
Yeah, maybe it's a bit more generality.
So as a general concept, what we're doing here is we're building two installations. We're building between single, I know it's so dark you can't really see what's going on. It's not you. It's the slide. It's me. It's the projector, of course. So the idea is that we're building two spaces, two physical spaces using, and we'll explain all the parts of it. And within each of these spaces, we're using computers and gaming engines to artificially light these spaces. So the idea here is that this is actually furniture in the room. not three-dimensional models of furniture, but actual furniture in the room. We create the shadows artificially that we see on the floor.
I
Yes?
think one of the key points, though, is the furniture is historical artifacts.
Right.
They're artifacts of heritage from the local area. So in Singapore, there'll be Singaporean artifacts. In London, there'll be British artifacts, hopefully with some kind of colonial and globalization kind of implication to them.
And so right now we're looking at the idea that we're at them being business spaces, offices, that kind of thing, as opposed to home spaces. And so what we're going to do is we're going to build these physical spaces, and the users and the audience should be able to walk into the space to a certain degree. The shadows that would be created by the idea that sunlight would come through, which will all be done artificially, will then be filled with video, which will be streaming from the other country. So we have this idea of the shadow will actually, so if I'm in London here, the shadow will actually be giving me footage, will give me, I'm not going to call it live, we're looking at probably it being a couple hours delayed, but relatively live footage of Singapore. So we'll see Singapore in the shadows in London, and we'll see London in the shadows in Singapore. And that's part of that idea of telepresence. So what are the elements of the installation? Basically, those are the elements. So what we're looking at is, again, how are we taking the historical and turning it into an experience, and how we turn it into an experience. That's an important thing. The idea that we're not just, we're not looking at something on a screen, we're trying to be very experiential. It is a physical space. We can walk through that physical space. We can experience that space. I think that's very important. And we want to do this, one of the ways that we want to do this, and we want to help to bring in the idea of heritage in itself as a continuum, is by the use of artifacts. And we're talking about a few different types, different concepts of artifact. And again, to bring us back to the issues that we were just talking about. So, what puts this together, what we conceptualized, was the idea that it was very important that we're talking about physical spaces. That we can't talk about time, space as just a virtual thing on a screen. We need it to be a physical space, so that we are talking about space. We're talking about the experience of time, space within space. Can I say that enough times? So one of the main forms of artifact is, as we were saying a few minutes ago, is the idea of bringing in furniture as archival elements. Furniture that's in normal use. They're elements of what was life, and we're looking at them, and we're looking at them as sort of a living archive in a way.
Yeah, I mean, a space is defined by the artifacts in it, as our Italian friend also mentioned in his talk earlier as well.
Yeah. And I guess we can just finish the talk by saying, and then we're using here, and it's like what he said, what he said, what he said, and it makes it easier for us. We're looking at shadows as being objects of both time, and the idea that shadows are sort of metaphorically about memory, about the trace, especially the idea of the trace as laid out by Levinas, I think very much. And so, shadows, I mean, if you think about it in this way, the shadows are determined by some sort of movement of time space, in that it's sunlight moving at the speed of light, being blocked by an object in space, giving us something that is kind of a trace, a memory of a distorted memory of something that is happening. We look at a shadow, we know what the things are that are out there. Also, kind of to relate it backwards a little bit, also in relation to art history, Marcel Duchamp always used to talk about the large glass, the bride stripped bare, as a four-dimensional shadow. The shadow is very important that way. So but one of the things that we're going to be doing that you haven't really seen, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a video of the image of what we're doing, is that one of the other elements that we're going to be adding in, which will again bring in this idea of the traces, we'll have the shadow of the objects, and the shadows will move over time, so we're replicating the idea of day and night, but we will also be adding in animated characters that move through the space, but we actually don't see. All we see is the shadows of them. So the space feels a little less static and feels a little bit more that it's being lived. So someone could be sitting at one desk and move to another desk. We don't see a character. We don't need an actor. It's not robotic. It's not a flat screen animation. It's only in the shadow. So we're seeing the characters of people who no longer exist. And that also reemphasizes this idea of history and of time and of trace and the idea of memory and continuum. Anything else you want to add? Okay.
So working alongside that, we have audio recordings, which will be testimony for us from past memory, but also from contemporary experience as well, from both locations. And these will not be directly connected to the shadows of the people. They will not be directly connected to any object, and the way their experience will be in a kind of mashed up kind of way.
Mm-hmm. So that we will have, and so one of the important things here is that if I go through the space, it isn't like I hear letters from home from people, let's say from Britain, who are living in Singapore, and then it goes back and it goes through a timeline until we eventually get to contemporary people. It will all be mixed up. You will not know, well, one of the things is we'll explain how the sound works, but you will not, there will be no way of consciously knowing when you go into the space. A, you won't be assuming that you're going to hear anything necessarily, and B, you won't feel that there is a path that you need to take to hear something in a particular order. There is no particular order to the idea of the testimony. The importance is that you hear these different things and they get mixed together. The past and the present are sort of always in dialogue with each other. It's kind of the idea of the remix again. It's all in the mix. So here's what the idea is. We would normally build a space like this, and you can see we just have normal shadows. You're building a space, you light it, the objects would have shadows, and then we want to fill those shadows with videos, with streaming video, and it would kind of look like this. This is actually down by Sentosa, so what you'll see in the middle there, this little yellow thing, is the train that takes people from the main island of Singapore over to Sentosa, which is where the Universal Studios is. And is also where, I think, I'm forgetting his name now, the person who was the longest under house arrest and anywhere in the world was on Sentosa Island.
But of course,
So-
you'd be seeing this in London. You'd be seeing Singapore
This is
in London.
this would be the London view, and you can see the shadows are moving. So the idea is that we'd also have the replication. So we're also working with the idea of various senses of time. We have the time of what time is it in Singapore, what time is it here. The shadows move across as if it's day or night, so a day can be 20 minutes. So we're playing with this idea of how do we understand time and presence, by creating a situation that kind of breaks it up and disjoins it, so that it becomes uncanny. Our sense of time becomes unloosened and becomes uncanny.
Because one of our primary, as a mankind, one of our primary experiences of time is obviously the passage of the sun. So it's a kind of our primary metaphor for it.
Right. It's the most primal way of understanding time. Time is something, again, it's also like they would say, I guess, is it Bergson? I forgot who say that. No, even Kant would say, how do we understand space? We don't really understand space. We understand space but only by experiencing how we move within it. The same thing is true with time. We only understand it by moving within it. It's very hard to sort of move outside of it to understand what it is. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to sort of compress elements so we are a little bit more conscious of our relationship to time and through time. So, to give you an idea of how this works, and actually the first part of, you see this has a white background, so the room is much brighter now. We're going to do sort of one test run that we're hoping to exhibit at the V&A. And this is sort of built off of that, so that's why we have a water tower. But this is your typical New York City water tower. When we see this on the roof of buildings, at least for myself, I think of New York. So we make a 3D, we're making, so the idea is that we're going to, like I said, we're going to be using real furniture, right? But to just give you an idea of how this works, to make that real furniture and get the shadow of that real furniture, we're going to have to make three-dimensional models of the existing furniture. So we're going to have modelers come in, when we have the idea of where all the furniture is, set that up, we're going to set up the room, they're going to have to recreate the room three-dimensionally. So we'll have models like this, and you can see it does have a bit of a shadow. The shadow will be filled with video. So just so you know what it is, that's the video, that's the water down at ADM, that's the shot from my 4th story window. So that's what the video is. And then, that does not show well on this projector. That does not show well at all. The idea is that we have the water tower and we have a shadow, and there you can see the water is moving through the shadow. We had to work long and hard with a programmer to be able to get that to work, but we can stream a movie through the shadow. And then, of course, the shadow can react to the environment that it's in. So the camera's moving here like the sun would in the final installation, but you can see the shadow is going up the wall because it's still considered a shadow, and it will project out onto the space however we need it to. So then when we build the final installation, what the next phase is going to have to be that we make the objects invisible, because we have no reason to project three-dimensional models of the real objects on top of the real objects. That's kind of a waste of time. That's kind of meaningless. We can actually make the three-dimensional objects disappear. And this also means because we can make the three-dimensional objects disappear and the video can still play through it, we can create the virtual characters to move through the place, be invisible, the video will continue to move through them. So the whole installation will have one continual image. The image will be, like I said, will be recorded every day. Because the time zone difference is about 8 hours, and also to make sure that, I guess one of the worries we have is, the technical worry is, if everything's playing live, the two issues are, most of the time it'll be nighttime wherever an installation is open. So all you'll see is darkness and a few lights wherever we've set up.
It's currently 4:30 in the morning in the UK.
Yeah.
So,
And the other issue is, if it's being recorded and then streamed and we have like a bit of a delay, like an 8-hour delay or something, we're kind of a little safer in case the whole system crashes at some point. If the camera crashes, the system crashes. It isn't suddenly, it crashes in London, I see it in Singapore, I ring him up in the middle of the night and say, you got to run over to, I don't know, the Greenwich Observatory, and you got to fix that camera, dude. You got to get them to open up the space. We need to do something. At least if we have a bit of a recording and delay, we're kind of saving ourselves from the inevitable, because we're assuming the first law of one of the first laws of computer technology, which is computers crash. So we will actually, and we will, like I said, when we do this in the VNA as our first test run, we will just have a shadow like this. It will be just running in the space of the museum, and that's all you would see. You wouldn't see the actual object. So it becomes, again, sort of an uncanny experience. And just to give you an idea, again, of what it looks like when it's running. What else do we want to add about this?
I think we're moving
What?
on to the audio now, aren't we?
What?
Moving on to the audio.
Okay, we'll move on to the audio. Okay. So from there, to explain, do you want to start to explain this, or should I?
Well, I mean, we wanted to find a way to so that there wouldn't just be a cacophony of different testimonies. So we looked into the technology of directional audio speakers. So this is what we found. Is these you can see the speaker on the left, and you can see a little diagram showing how it projects to people in toilets. So they're obviously toilet symbols. No. So you have the speaker on the left is what a normal speaker would do, but this has like a 5-degree angle of incidence. So only if you're standing right in front of it, do you hear it? Right. So as you move around the space, if you're standing here, you'll hear one voice. If you move over a few feet to the left, you'll hear a different voice, and so you'll be able to walk around and get a different experience from different audio sources.
And to give you an idea, these speakers that hold with the board and everything is about this big. So we can sort of put them into spaces, we can kind of hide them very easily. And when he's saying they're very directional, the way it would work is, quite literally, we could aim it, if I had one in my hand now, I could aim it and you would hear the sound and you wouldn't. And because it's that sort of, and especially in this kind of space that we're talking about, since it's that specific, as we put them across the installation, and since they're hidden and you have no idea where they are, you go through zones of sound, but when you walk into the installation, you don't know that there's sound. So you experience everything again in kind of an uncanny way, in a way that you stumble upon something, you suddenly find sound. Hopefully it'll kind of stop you and you'll listen to what it is, and it will go on. And then when you go on to the next sound, it's not a continuous movement of telling one particular story, but it's much more of a sort of mixed movement. Times, the histories, the people who do things, where, like I said, we have the archival texts that we'll be using, and we'll have actors read them. We're also going to be interviewing people who are living in who are British and living in Singapore, and Singaporeans living in the UK about their life now, so that we'll be mixing these things together. So then the question is, when we put all this together with these concerns, and this is very important, is we need to ask the question, what does the user experience? How do they go into the space? How do they experience the space? And hopefully they get whatever they get out of it through the experience, as opposed to through reading a text explaining it. What you were going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that we're trying to do something here which is has to still be aesthetic and still be something that people will enjoy, or maybe find some sublime experience from walking through, whilst also having some quite grand theoretical intention. So I'm very pleased to hear the word praxis in the keynote talks, because we're trying to blend all this theory with an actual artifact, which is very often a very difficult and quite often a failing thing to do. So we've tried to bring in lots of different elements. So it does have, because one of the key things is to have some form of interaction, so that it's not just a kind of static artifact. So there's a reason to kind of spend time with this as an object.
I mean, the way that this project developed was, personally, I've done a lot of work dealing with the concept of shadows, which goes back to reading about and also knowing someone who grew up in Hiroshima, and that when the bomb blasted, the heat sort of wiped a lot of things away, wiped the grime off of walls and things like that. And you had shadows that someone I know growing up in the 60s and 70s still saw in the city. And shadows is this sense of a form of memory, a form of displacement of something that leaves that trace, has always been interesting to me. And then meeting someone here who was trying to work with projectors like this to create artificial lighting spaces, I started to think about the idea that if I light this room, this is kind of also an important part of this, which I didn't really go into. But one of the things that we can also do here is that we can light these rooms so that we can imitate the sunlight from other places. So that Singapore can have shadows that would be equivalent to what you get in London, and London can get Singaporean shadows. So our sense of where the sun is, in terms of sense of time, what we see in terms of video and so on, all these things we can jumble up and we can start mixing. And I found that a very interesting concept. I found the idea of moving into this time-space thing very, very important, and sort of that idea of what you can do with artificial lighting and artificial shadows. And then from there, I entered into discussion with this guy, for some reason, I don't know why. And we kind of worked
have a
this
strong theoretical affinity, but also those who are there for my talk yesterday will realise that I have a strong focus on bringing heritage to a new type of user. So this is something that this is hoping to do as well, is to give an experience of heritage that is for a user focus for a different type of user, which isn't just placing the heritage in front of you with a card saying, here's a desk from the 19th century, it was used by the East India Company, and that's it. And bringing it to life in the hybrid kind of.
And very much for me, this idea of, Bergson talks about the idea of duration and how things are lived and evolve over time, and there's that things are always part of an active living continuum, is very important to myself and my work, so that with the work that he's done and sort of how it relates back to my senses of history and time, it was a very sort of, and also we've known each other for a long time, it was a very natural fit. And we were able to develop this thing out into something that hopefully will actually seem interesting. It'll be something I actually want to go into, and it'll be a good experience that brings this experience together in a way that feels natural, that doesn't feel forced, feels natural, and will have a very interesting and sort of very uncanny experience to the user. So the user would move into the space, the speakers would be hidden wherever. Let's say we might hide some underneath the, on sort of parts of the desk or wherever. We're going to make them so they're not visible, they're not readily visible. You can put them on a wall. They're very, very small, so if I can put them on a wall and put a little casing over them and continue the look of the walls, let's say if we paint the walls and so on, we can litter them all over the place, 6, 7, 10, however we need. And as you walk through the space, you constantly get this experience that is multidimensional and sort of uncanny in a way of kind of bringing us out of our present, bringing us into somewhere without seeming like, oh, we're going back to a historical recreation of something, and emphasizing this idea of you know, telepresence as a kind of virtual globalization that is also a way of being also the historical. I don't know what else to say. What else do we need to say here?
Well, it tells.
It's done. Give us a good finish. How good is your tap dancing?
Pretty bad,
Okay.
actually. I'm more of a trumpet player.
Oh, okay. Oh, you should have brought your trumpet.
I should have done. That would have been good to end with a fanfare. Actually.
Yeah, it would have. So the idea is that we're trying to get a very, very visceral experience that can give us that we can understand theoretically, but we understand more as, again, as an artistic experience, as a visceral experience, as something that is a physical embodiment of something, so that it isn't, like I said, it isn't screen-based, it isn't something that we have a distance and we're virtual from, but something that the immersive element of it becomes, should we use the word? Yeah, it becomes almost overwhelming. It becomes something that we feel as a physical embodiment, that we become part of this piece by how we react to it and how we feel to it, as opposed to it first being an intellectual thing and then something we think we're supposed to experience on an aesthetic level. We want to collapse all these things together into a very sort of powerful experience. And I think that's it.
I think that's it.
If you want to talk to us, if you want any more information, give us lots and lots of cash, whatever. This is how you can find, this is who we are, and this is how we can find us.
Ken, put your professor's hat on, please, please, please.
Well, lots and
Yeah,
lots of
good,
cash.
good. Yes.
You
Thank you
especially.
Thank you very much. Thank you.